Well, welcome everybody to this Region, Cities and Industry webinar from the RSA on COVID and gender. My name is Alan Kinder. I'm the Chief Executive of the Regional Studies Association. It's my great pleasure to be chairing this discussion this afternoon or today. And if you haven't heard of the RSA, by the way, we are the global community for regional and urban research, development and policy. So you're very welcome. So housekeeping notes from me first. Please note that this session is being recorded and it is going to be available later on through the RSA website and the RSA app. If you have any questions during the session, I'm sure you will, please use the Q&A box, which is at the bottom of the screen. And once we've heard from Gainbi and her fascinating presentation, then when it comes to the Q&A, I'll be using the questions that you've typed in to drive that discussion. Okay, so on to the introduction for the session. Today's session explores a really vital and a very timely topic, I think. It's called Mind the Gap, Gender, Geography and the Effects of the COVID-19 Pandemic on Publication in Regional Studies Association Journals. And as I'm sure you know, if you've joined us, the COVID-19 pandemic had major impacts on academic life, not just at the RSA, but across the world. And the paper we're going to hear about this afternoon looks at how those effects played out in terms of gender and in terms of geography by analysing submissions to RSA's journals between 2018 and 2022. With the help of Taylor and Francis, our publishing partner, and using gender estimating tools and data on author locations, the study examines changes in submission and acceptance patterns, differences across journals and across regions, and it also examines long-standing gender disparities that were present before the pandemic, but continued during and indeed after it. And these findings, of course, are an important contribution to the conversation about equity and inclusion in academic publishing. And they also point to areas where more support might be needed. And I'm delighted to say that quite recently, actually, the paper was published. It's been published open access and is available right now through Regional Studies under the title Mind the Gap, Gender, Geography and the Effects of the COVID-19 Pandemic on Publication in Regional Studies Association Journals. So I'm going to turn over in a moment to Gainbi. Gainbi is at Newcastle University at the Kurds unit. She's lecturing quantitative human geography in the Centre for Urban and Regional Development Studies. She completed her doctoral degree in geography at the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee in 2021. And Gainbi's research interests include social vulnerability to natural hazards, population change, and spatial injustice using various geospatial analysis and quantitative methodologies. So great pleasure to welcome you today, Gainbi. We're very much looking forward to what you have to say on this important topic. And the floor is yours.
Thank you for the warm introduction. I'm going to share my slide. Okay. Can you see my screen? Yep. Okay, today I'm going to talk about our project on Mind the Gap. This project was started in 2022, and I'm very happy to share our finding with you all today. Before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge the generous support of the Regional Studies Association, whose funding made this research possible. And we are also grateful to Taylor and Francis for providing access to the manuscript submission data and for their valuable guidance throughout the project. I'd also like to take a moment to introduce our research team. So this project was a collaborative effort with Professor Rachel Franklin, an executive director at the Center for Geographic Analysis at Harvard, Sally Hardy, the former chief executive at RSA, Professor Jesse Poon at University of Buffalo, and Professor Simona Ianmarino at University of Cagliari. This is the outline of today's talk. I'll begin with a brief overview of the literature on gender inequality in research landscape and academic publishing practice. Next, I'll outline our methodological approach and describe the data we used. And in the results section, I'll present overall submission trend across all RSA journals, then break them down by authorship and by individual journal. And finally, I'll conclude with some key takeaways from our findings. Gender influences every aspect of life, and the world of research is no exception. Its impact is evident across the entire academic and research landscape. A substantial body of literature has examined gender inequality in research productivity from a variety of perspectives. Numerous studies have highlighted systematic gender disparities at every stage of knowledge production, including the peer review process, access to grant and research funding, research collaboration, and publication authorship. Especially gender disparities in academic publishing productivity have persisted for decades. Female researchers have historically published fewer papers, resulting in lower citation impact. And women are also underrepresented on editorial board and receive less competitive funding and are more likely to hold casual or short-term academic positions, and all of which constrain their research productivity. These long-standing structural inequalities contribute to a persistent gap in both academic output and recognition. And publications are still one of the main ways we measure academic performance, and they play a big role in shaping academic careers. But it's important to recognize that gender influences many parts of the publishing process, even when it's not immediately visible. That's why our research focuses specifically on the gendered dynamics of academic publishing. When you take a closer look at the publication landscape, we see that gendered dynamics play out across multiple stages, from submission and acceptance rate to who gets key authorship roles like first author, corresponding authors, or solo author. And even co-authorship network and citation patterns reflect persistent gender imbalances. So why is this happening? These disparities are not simply about individual productivity. They are also shaped by broader systematic issues like gender imbalances in gatekeeping and decision-making processes. So editors and editorial boards have significant influence throughout the publication process. They shape what gets published, whose voices are heard, and which topics or methods are seen as legitimate in the field. Their decisions influence the direction of journals, the peer review process, and ultimately whether a manuscript is accepted or rejected. So this is referred to as admission gatekeeping. But the process doesn't end there. There's another layer called inclusion gatekeeping. This happens when individual researchers decide whose work to cite, engage with, or ignore, and it's often shaped by personal preferences or unconscious bias. So altogether, these gatekeeping practice play a critical role in shaping what becomes mainstream knowledge and who gets visibility within academic discipline. And most academic work today is built on collaboration. But as co-authorship becomes more common, it's also introduced new layers of gender inequality, especially when it comes to how credit and recognitions are shared. So research shows that most co-authored papers are still produced by all male teams, while all female teams make up only a small share of journal articles, even though cross-gender collaborations are becoming more common. And the gender gap in collaboration isn't just about who works together, it's also about how credit is distributed. Previous studies have found that women often receive less recognition and less favorable evaluation than their male colleagues from co-authored papers. Lately, there has been a lot of discussion about how the COVID-19 pandemic has affected academic publishing and research landscape. The pandemic didn't just disrupt our daily lives, it completely changed the way we learn, teach, and carry out research, especially with the sudden shift to working from home. And as lockdown began, there was immediate concern about how researchers would be affected around the world. And these were the kind of conversation that came up during the pandemic. So women's research plummeted during lockdown, but articles from men increased. Are women published less during the pandemic? The pandemic deepened gender inequality in dual career household. One of the big concerns was that pandemic would deepen the gender inequalities that already existed in academia. When we talk about research productivity, especially around publishing, there's now a growing body of evidence coming from different disciplines. But when it comes to whether the pandemic imposed an additional penalty on women in research, the evidence is still quite mixed. Early in the pandemic, some studies found that women, especially those in the early stage of their careers, were submitting fewer papers than men. For example, one study found that up to May 2020, submission rate had dropped more noticeably for early career women. Another study also found that women's overall research productivity declined in the early months of the pandemic, leading to fewer papers being submitted or published by female authors or all-female teams. On top of that, other studies pointed to a decline in women's representation in key authorship roles like first author. In contrast to earlier findings, more recent evidence tells a slightly different story. So in some areas, women's publication rate actually increased compared to men's during the pandemic. And in some fields, there hasn't been any clear impact on publication patterns at all, even though there were still signs that submission rate had generally slowed down. So overall, it's still a mixed picture. Based upon the literature review, research on gender and geographic disparities in academic publishing really highlight the importance of tracking trends with good data and documenting them carefully. Without clear baseline figure, it becomes very difficult to identify inequalities or to see whether things are improving or getting worse over time. So in this context, our study contributed to this growing body of work by focusing on publication patterns that emerged during the COVID-19 pandemic. And we focus on journals within the Regional Studies Association, the family journals, which provide a valuable case for exploring how the pandemic may have affected publishing inequalities across gender and geography. Our study draws on a unique data set of manuscript submission provided by Taylor and Francis, the publisher of the RSA journals. And this data set tracks each paper's journey from submission to acceptance, allowing us to closely look at the early stage of the publication process, not just the final outcome. So with this data, we are able to establish a recent baseline of submission and publication trend across 5 RSA journals. We focused on data from January 2018 to December 2022, covering the pre-pandemic, pandemic, and post-pandemic period. Although the RSA now publish 6 journals, we left out finance and space from our analysis because it was launched in 2023. Taylor and Francis used the Scholar One system to keep track of manuscript status and author information like names and institutional affiliations. For our study, they shared data on all manuscripts submitted for peer review between 2018 and 2022. We worked with two main data sets, one at the manuscript level and one at the author level. Author names were especially important as we used them to estimate gender. And each manuscript had a unique ID, which allowed us to link submissions with their authors. And the author information also has associated manuscript ID so that we can link them together. Altogether, the dataset gives us a solid foundation to work with, covering 7,858 manuscript submissions and 27,323 unique authors across all RSA journals during this period. Since self-reported gender wasn't collected at the time of submissions, we used a name-based gender attribution algorithm to estimate the gender of each author. The algorithm classified name as male, female, or unknown based on binary outcomes with varying levels of accuracy. Using this information, we generated a manuscript-level master dataset, and for each submission, we derived variables such as the number of authors, the number of female authors, and the lead author's gender and country. So out of the 7,832 submissions where we could identify the lead author's gender, around 69% were led by men and 31% were led by women. Using the manuscript level dataset, we carried out a descriptive analysis to explore how female academics were represented over time. So we grouped submissions into 6 authorship constellations: solo male, solo female, all male team, all female team, male-led mixed gender team, and female-led mixed gender team. So if the manuscript includes at least one female collaborator with the lead author being male, then it's classified as male-led mixed gender team. So these groupings allow us to examine how submission and editorial decision trend have changed over time across different types of authorship. And for geographic analysis, we focused on the lead authors and grouped their countries by continent rather than by individual countries. This broader approach helped us better understand the geographical patterns in gendered research productivity. Now moving on to the results section. This figure shows overall submission trend across RSA journal from 2018 to 2022. This gives us a broad sense of how submission activity shifted over the pandemic period. And as you can see, there's a sharp increase in submissions during the pandemic. So in 2020, submissions increased by 52% compared to 2018 and increased by 31% compared to 2019. The momentum slowed a little bit in 2021 with a slight drop in submissions, possibly reflecting a delayed impact of the pandemic. But by 2022, we saw the highest, but by 2022, submission numbers had started to rise again. So in 2022, we saw the highest number of submissions since 2018. However, given the rapid growth between 2018 and 2020, the increase in 2022 was more modest than expected. Breaking it down by journals, regional studies didn't show any sign of a pandemic-related slowdown. As you can see here, submission kept rising steadily year after year. The other four journals, SCA, TPG, RSRS, and ADP, all saw noticeable jump in submissions in 2020. That spike might suggest that many of those papers were already close to completion when the pandemic began. Then in 2021, SCA, TPG, and RSRS all experienced a dip in submissions, which may point to a delayed impact on research productivity. By 2022, submission levels for regional studies, SCA, and TPG seems to be recovering. On the other hand, RSRS appeared to show more of a delayed pandemic effect, and ADP only start to show sign of impact in 2022. Now moving on to submission trend by authorship type. This figure shows the patterns across 6 authorship categories. So in the case of regional studies, most submissions throughout the study period came from either all male teams or male-led mixed gender team. However, we can see encouraging sign of growing participation by female authors in collaborative work. Submissions from female-led mixed gender teams have been steadily increasing since 2018, possibly reflecting more women stepping into research leadership role. Looking at solo author submissions, both solo female and solo male submission have declined over time. However, across the entire period, solo male authors submitted roughly twice the amount compared to solo female authors. So this gender gap in solo submissions is not unique to regional studies. It's fairly consistent pattern across the other RSA journal as well. Turning to spatial economic analysis, the overall submission trends are quite similar to those in regional studies, with all male teams continuing to dominate throughout the period. By 2022, male authors made up 71.2% of total authors, which is the highest proportion of male authorship across all RSA journals. And between 2018 and 2022, male-led and all-male teams actually increased their share of submission, despite a slight dip between 2021 and 2022. On the other hand, solo female submission steadily dropped over this period and haven't really bounced back yet. And submissions from all female team did increase a little bit, but only returned to their 2018 levels by 2022. Turning to territory politics governance, this journal has historically attracted relatively more submission from solo authors of both gender, as you can see in the graph. This is likely due to its focus on political themes, although this trend has declined over time. There's a clear gender gap in solo submissions. So in 2018, 41.3% of submissions came from solo male authors compared to just 19% from solo female authors. We also saw signs of possible pandemic impact among 3 groups, all male teams, solo male authors, and solo female authors, each showing noticeable shift during that period. By 2022, that pattern had changed again, with all male team becoming the dominant co-authorship group. In regional studies and regional science, the authorship distribution was relatively diverse back in 2018, but one noticeable change is that solo female submission dropped by more than half between 2018 and 2022. One possible reason for this could be the increase in article processing charges, which rose from £615 in 2020 to £1,460. A recent study found that during the pandemic, women submitted fewer grant proposals, resulting in lower access to external funding, often used to cover APC charge. So reduced funding and rising APC cost may have limited research progress and publishing opportunities. And these factors likely created a delayed knock-on effect, placing a greater burden on female researchers and disproportionately affecting their productivity. Now moving on to the Area Development and Policy Journal. ADP received the fewest submission of all the RSA journals, just 485 in total over the study period. Because of the small sample size, the trend line tends to fluctuate quite a bit from year to year. And most submissions came from solo male authors who made up about 28% on average over 5 years. But unlike the other genres, we actually saw an increase in solo female submissions with a noticeable jump between 2020 and 2021. Now moving on to geographic analysis. This figure shows the share of manuscript submissions from 6 continents. Across all RSA genre except ADP, most submissions come from Europe, followed by Asia and North America. The other continents make up only a small share of the total. In the case of ADP, Asia consistently leads, accounting for about 53.5% of all submissions during the study period. This is likely reflect the journal's focus on emerging economies and the fact that its editorial board is based in China. In regional studies, the gap between Europe and Asia has narrowed since 2018, despite the pandemic, with Asia nearly overtaking Europe's long-standing prominence. Asia's strong presence is also clear in SCA and RSRS, with SCA showing an earlier shift starting in 2020. While most journals show a narrowing gap between submissions from Asia and Europe, TPG is a bit different. So European-led submissions have continued to widen their lead over time. This might have to do with differences in publishing cultures. In many Asian academic settings, quantitative positivist research is more common, and publishing in English is often more accessible when using quantitative method. But since TPG leans more toward qualitative and theoretical framework, the work, it can pose greater language and methodological challenges, especially for researchers outside English speaking or Western academic tradition. Submitting a manuscript is just one part of the publishing process. The other is what happens next, whether it gets accepted or not. So our third research question focused on editorial decisions. So we wanted to understand how acceptance patterns have changed over time and whether COVID-19 had any influence on them. To explore this, we'll look at the proportion of accepted submissions by authorship type, geographic region, and decision outcome. It's important to note that in our data set, decisions are tied to the year of submissions, not the year the decision was actually made. So if a manuscript was submitted in 2018 but accepted in 2020, it's still recorded under 2018. Let's take a look at some of the key acceptance trends. So for regional studies, on average, the acceptance rate was around 16%. Most of the accepted papers came from all-male teams, male-led mixed-gender teams, and female-led mixed-gender team. And when we focus on solo authors, we see a clear gender gap in acceptance rate. So in 2018, solo male authors had about 3 times more accepted papers than solo female authors. In 2020, the gap grew, so 5 times more papers were accepted from solo men than solo women. And by 2021, things had improved slightly, but men were still twice as likely to have solo papers accepted. So we saw the same trend in collaborative research. In 2019, all male teams had over 6 times more paper accepted than all male teams. Now turning to spatial economic analysis, its acceptance rate stayed fairly stable, averaging 16.5% over the period. However, there were no accepted papers from solo female authors in both 2018 and 2021. In response, the journal has started taking steps to promote gender diversity. And finally, across all years, all male teams consistently had the highest share of accepted paper, and there wasn't any clear pandemic-related shift in this trend. Territory politics and governance. On average, this journal accepted about 33.9% of submissions. So before the pandemic, the acceptance ratio between solo male and solo female authors was 3:1, but that improved to 1.4:1 during the pandemic. So we are seeing some sign of progress in terms of a female researcher visibility in this journal. Moving on to regional studies, regional science, which had the highest overall acceptance rate at 33.4%. Back in 2018, solo male and solo female authors had almost equal number of accepted papers. But since then, our gender gap has started to open up, with solo male authors increasingly making up a larger share of accepted papers. Now looking at area development and policy. In 2018, most accepted papers came from solo male authors and all male teams. That year, only one paper was accepted from a solo female author and one from an all-female team, even though things have improved a bit over time. However, acceptance numbers in ADP are still quite small, so it's hard to draw any firm conclusion about the impact of the pandemic. Now bringing together geography and gender, this map shows the female to male author submission ratio by country from 2018 to 2022. A ratio above 1 means that more submissions came from female authors than male authors in that country. So as you can see, many countries in Africa and Middle East show lower ratio, meaning fewer submissions from women compared to men. We see similar patterns in parts of Asia like South Korea and Japan, and in Europe, including Norway and Greece. However, there are notable outliers. So in countries like Ukraine, Azerbaijan, Lithuania, Russia, Iceland, and Kazakhstan, female authors actually submitted more than male authors. So we also see this trend in Bolivia in South America. And this geographical pattern is not random. It reflects the legacy of the Soviet Union, where government policies actively promoted gender equality and encouraged women's participation in the labor force. To summarize, we found that RSA journals were quite resilient through the pandemic. There was a dip in submissions, but by 2022, we are already seeing a sign of recovery. When it comes to gender inequality, the pattern is pretty clear and persistent. So most submissions are still coming from solo male, all-male teams, or male-led mixed gender teams. The pandemic didn't seem to widen this gap, but unfortunately, it didn't help close it either. So we are also seeing a slow shift in geography. So there has been a gradual decline in European dominance and a noticeable increase in submissions from Asia. That's a promising sign of internationalization of the RSA journals, but some regions in the global south are still underrepresented. Looking at who's getting published, the patterns mirror submissions. So most accepted papers are still coming from all male or male-led teams. And one exception here is TPG journal, where we are seeing more mixed gender leadership in recent years. And one of the deeper issues here is the dominance of male-oriented research network. And these networks continue to shape who collaborate, who submit, and who gets published, reinforcing long-standing structural inequalities in academia. This research provides benchmark data and analysis to support ongoing effort to tackle inequities in academic publishing. It helps us identify and track persistent pattern of imbalance. While it doesn't solve everything, it still offers a meaningful foundation to build on. And one key lesson from the pandemic is this. In order to address gender and geographic imbalances, we first need to measure them. That means improving how we collect and monitor equity and diversity data in publishing. In order to do that, we need data that goes beyond the basic, like name or affiliation, and capture meaningful aspects of researchers' identities and experience, such as gender identity, race, ethnicity, disability status, career stage, or team compositions. And quantitative data is useful, but it doesn't tell the whole story. It gives us an overall picture, but it cannot explain why authors make the choice they do, like why they submit, where they submit, or who they choose to work with. That's where deeper and qualitative research really matters. And we also know that male authors dominate in terms of submissions and publications. But what we don't fully understand yet is why. Is it about early training opportunities, or is it a classic leaky pipeline with women leaving academia at a higher rate? Or could it be an age structural problem that might even out over time? Or is there some bias at play, whether editors are favoring like certain topics or team leaders choosing who they want to collaborate with? These are the tough and complex questions, but that's what we need to ask for to make a real change. So these are the key takeaway from this paper and then this project. And if you are interested in learning more about this project, our paper is available now at Regional Studies. And if you read this paper, you can also find a deeper case study, in-depth submission trend by authorship type across continent in Regional Studies journal. So please have a look at this journal. And thank you all for listening, and I'm happy to take any questions. Thank you.
Well, Gainbi, thank you. I mean, that was absolutely splendid presentation. And while people are just gathering their thoughts, to type in questions in that's using the Q&A button that you see at the bottom of your screen. Just to say again, thanks on behalf of everybody. A really thought-provoking presentation, superbly well laid out and structured, and it really sets out very, very clearly the types of questions that you had investigated, but also further questions for investigation down the line. So as people are gathering their thoughts, I wonder if it's okay to ask one or two questions that came to my mind. Are you happy for me to do that, Gainbi?
Yeah.
Oh, wonderful. Okay. Going back to the early part of the presentation, you set out for us this idea of gatekeeping, and you spoke about different types of gatekeeping and how they operate. Are you able to say a little bit more for us about what really kind of you think maybe is going on in that process of gatekeeping? Why is it leading to outcomes which are not equitable? And are you aware of any journals or other fields where more equitable gatekeeping is in place? Part of the reason for me asking that question is, of course, when it comes to a peer review of an article, then that is a process whereby the authors are blinded. You know, the reviewer doesn't know about the identity of the authors, whereas at the submission stage, that may not be the case. So I just wondered whether you had any thoughts or reflections on things that could be done really to make the submission stage for journals and the gatekeeping that you have observed, the effects of that gatekeeping. Is there any sort of thoughts or reflections from you on how that might be treated a little differently?
I think for the journal submissions and the review process, it might be worth collecting more data, like about self-identified information in terms of gender and career stage, and then maybe the journal may need to collect those information, and then when they assign the reviewers and then editors, I think they need to take into account those information, the equity and diversity information to promote EDI issues and then tackle the gatekeeping issues. Yeah, that's what I thought based on this project. Yeah, and maybe there might be actually there's not many training about how to review the paper and how to improve how to practice inclusive reviewing process. There's no training or there's no discussion around that. So maybe it might be worth having that kind of conversation and training opportunities for reviewers. That's what I think.
Right. Thanks, Gainbi, for your answer to that. And it really speaks to your earlier point about the need for data. So here's a question from Emma Ormerod. Great talk, Gainbi. Thanks so much. I wondered what this gender gap in publishing does to our fields of study. Were there any links you saw in gender and particular topics? So I think the question, I was thinking, if I'm reading the question correctly here, I was thinking a similar thing when I was listening. Is I was just wondering whether you and the team had analysed these sorts of patterns at the level of topic, which is rather different to analysing at the level of a journal title. So were there any links that you saw with gender and particular types of topic in our field?
It's a good question, but let me think about this. It's not directly related to a particular topic, but I thought I want to investigate more on the editorial board distribution in each journal to improve to promote equity in publishing practice. That's what came to my mind while working on this project. Yeah. And maybe one research look at the gender distribution in each publication, like a topic. So one research pull all the data based on the title, and then they look at each specific topic and categories by gender. So yeah, that could be a good potential research in the future. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. I think that's very well said. I'm sure other people will have questions. In fact, I'm so sure one's popped in straight away. So, Tony Champion, can you allow for the gender dimension of the full staff, the relevant geography, social science parts of the institutions where the submitters are based? So that's a challenging question, isn't it?
Gender dimension of the full.
I suppose this is getting at some of the things that you were beginning to get onto, some of those sort of deeper, more underlying issues that might account for these patterns. I think the question here is getting at, you know, what's the gender dimension, the gender balance for those institutions where submitters are based. Is that part of the picture?
Mm. Oh, it's a tough question.
It's a tough. We've got a very critically engaged audience today, which is wonderful, asking some very searching questions. And of course, we've already acknowledged that part of the picture here is the lack of, and therefore the need for more data and more analysis. So yes, like Russia being more equal across the board, I think that's saying. In other words, I think what's being said here is that if those institutions in Russia are already more gender balanced, does that also then help to account for the submissions and the authorship that you were analysing? It's a tough one, isn't it? Should we sort of let that sink in for a moment, that question?
Yeah.
Rattle around. Maybe to help a little bit here. One of the other questions in my own mind was, and I think you did touch on this, Gainbi, in your talk, but if we as an audience, being very interested in this topic, wanted to go and learn more and read more, and it may be that we wanted to read on other disciplines and other fields, are you aware of any studies which are anything at all like the one that you've presented on today? I know that you talked at the beginning about the broad base of research in this area, but are you aware of other studies where we could go and have a look at authorship and submissions for comparator or even for very different sorts of disciplines?
Yeah, there's a report from L. Silver in 2020 and 2021. I think I cited the paper in the report in my paper. I think they they look at the data, like 10 years of data, and then look at the gender diversity, and then by field and by authorship categories and at the country level. But they only focused on like 15 countries. But I think it's worth looking at those paper. Yeah.
Interesting that that's come from a publisher, isn't it? I think that's really, maybe that's one of the ways forward here, is to think about publishers and the resources they may have to bring to bear on analysing some of this work. I'm just going to scroll down my Q&A button, make sure. We've got one here from Luke. So, hi Gainbi, thanks for your presentation. Did your analysis uncover evidence of stronger, more frequent international collaboration among research teams over the period? Just wondering about the limitation of using the lead author affiliation as the geographical marker.
We only focused on the lead author gender information because of the limited data. Yeah, but it was unfortunate that we couldn't really look at the international collaboration. And then when we look at the data, some people actually moved to different countries after like PhD, for example. So it was accurately estimating international collaboration. Yeah, that was the downside of the data. Yeah.
Thank you. Well, thank you again, Gainbi, both for your presentation and for your answers to these, really searching questions. I think one thing that's obvious from your talk and from this Q&A is that more work really should be done in this area, and it'd be interesting to trace how that progresses over time. As we said at the beginning of the webinar today, this paper is available online. It is open access. It's available through regional studies under the title Mind the Gap, Gender, Geography and the Effects of the COVID-19 Pandemic on Publication in Regional Studies Association journals. And it is highly recommended reading. So thanks to everybody for your involvement and the questions and for taking part. And on behalf of everybody, thanks in particular to you, Gainbi, for an excellent presentation today.